In the beginning of the 21st century, there was a realization that this is not about merchandising at its core. How many toys can you sell? But actually, it's about characters that are beloved around the world by a whole hell of a lot of people who really give a damn. And that the audience had become a little bit too sophisticated to simply make fun of their superheroes, and the dawning finally that it did matter. The transition to the point that was like a godsend, where an independent filmmaker who happened to have a passion for a character and a love for a character, even though he did not have endless credits for huge studio pictures, was allowed to express his vision for it and execute his vision in full support by the studio and everyone involved. The bar would be raised so high that all of a sudden, and something that was always unheard of, audiences could walk out of a movie based on a comic book, based on a superhero, and instead of saying, that was a great superhero movie, that was a great comic book movie, at last what they could say, that was a great film.
As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be everlasting.
When Batman Begins came out, the whole idea of rebooting a franchise with a new director and new actors and a whole new creative approach was kind of unheard of.
Relaunching an established franchise, you know, it was definitely a jump off of a cliff. It was, you know, an attempt to say, you know, we're going to kind of pretend that these movies that made hundreds of millions of dollars and were seen by people all around the world didn't exist, and start from scratch.
And I think that they could have gone one of two ways. Way one was, you know, let's play it safe. And way two was, let's just completely and totally entrust somebody to take this and make it their own.
I think the first time I heard that Warner Brothers was interested in making a Batman film, Chris was sort of looking around for something to do, and his agent called me and said, Warner's is looking to make another Batman film, and I was like, I don't think there's any world in which Chris would be interested in that. Because my reference for the movies were the previous ones, and I just didn't really see that Chris would have any interest in doing that. I just mentioned it in passing to Chris, hey, you know, Dan Cool, he was saying this, and I didn't think that was anything for you, right? And he was like, no, that's really exciting, because I've always thought there was a Batman story that hasn't been told on film.
Batman was a project that we were waiting for the right time and the right elements to come together.
When I went in and talked to them about it, it was very open. And that's a great opportunity, particularly for a writer-director.
Chris came in and said, look, you know, this is what I want to do in the movie. This is what I want to do with it visually. This is where I think the character needs to go. I think it's going to be different than any superhero movie anybody's seen before. And what I really want to do is like take that genre and embrace it as a real film genre.
I immediately started talking to them about the origin story.
You know, the rage that drives you, that impossible anger strangling the grief until the memory of your loved one is just poison in your veins.
They felt that there was a great little gap there in pop culture terms, particularly because the origin story, it wasn't addressed in Tim Burton's film, but it also wasn't really addressed in the comics.
The pitch that Chris had was it was quick. It was 10 or 15 minutes, but it was so holistic. And it really was Batman Begins.
And you know, I looked at Chris and said, okay, thanks, man. You know, appreciate your coming in. And I said, let me talk to Alan for a couple of minutes. And we looked at each other and I said, look, you know, if you're gonna back a guy off a pitch, I think this is a guy to do it with. And Alan Horn greenlit the movie off of that pitch.
I think Warner Brothers took a huge chance by going with Chris. Not that he doesn't have the skill set, obviously, to do something like this, but I'm sure the first inclination was to go with somebody who had proven that they could do a $100 million or $200 million movie.
Chris, at that point, had only really made 3 feature films. You have to hand it to the Suits for saying, well, I'd rather go with someone who has absolute clarity and confidence in what they're doing. Here's exactly what it's gonna look like. Here's how I wanna cast it. Here's how I want it to feel. Here's how I want it to sound. Than someone who's basically just gonna sit at the table and give us exactly what we expect. Because we tried that before, and it didn't really work.
I never experienced any hesitation of should we do Batman with Chris Nolan. There was zero hesitation. There was a time after Batman Begins was finished, I remember it, and we saw the movie, that someone said, God, this movie's incredible, this is unbelievable, this is so great, the movie's gonna be such a huge hit. Can you imagine if this hadn't worked? And can you imagine if we rebooted Batman and it wasn't good? And I realized it was the first time that it had ever been brought up. Everything was just pure optimism.
To hear that Christopher Nolan was doing it, that made me very excited. Much more so than if a director who was known for doing fantasy films had picked up the franchise and run with it. He's not the usual suspect. He's not a guy who's so wedded to the comics that he's going to do a literal interpretation of that, which is going to be pretty dull.
All his movies up to that point were about moral choice. They were about characters in extreme moral situations. They were labyrinths of interconnecting memories and interconnecting set pieces that built in a way that was almost mathematical, but if you would, they were emotional mathematics, which is unique to Chris. And that was really interesting to think that this genre, this myth, would be tackled by somebody that was an emotional mathematician, in a way.
Well, I think one of the things that makes Chris unique is that he respects the script so much, and I don't think he'll get into a project or start filming until the screenplay is just right.
At the core of it, there's still a really great story, and then when you dress it with all that other cool stuff, then that makes it a million times better, as opposed to just being either an empty movie with a bunch of gadgets and special effects, or the opposite, which is just a heavy story and not enough of the gadgets or the special effects.
The studio were actually very excited by what they heard Chris talk about, really presenting an origin story for the character. They seemed to be completely on board with that. What I think was a little challenging probably for the studio more than the film that we were making was the fact that we were saying to them, well, yes, we understand that you need to make your lunch boxes, but you have to be really careful with that, and really we need to be leading with the movie first, and that stuff needs to come later. Chris and I had many conversations with the studio about the fact that we really needed to be treating the film as the thing.
For us, it was really simple. We weren't making a movie necessarily to drive consumer products. Even to the extent that we weren't really making a Batman movie, we were making a Chris Nolan movie.
I took away your fear, and I showed you a path.
When I was growing up, there were a lot of grand-scale entertainments being done at the time by those great filmmakers. Obviously Lucas and Spielberg being the guys sort of leading the charge, and then into the early 80s. And so in my formative years, I was seeing a lot of very high-quality, large-scale blockbusters. When we were looking at the sort of cinematic landscape coming up to Batman Begins, it felt like a very long time since I'd seen the tone of movie that had defined the blockbuster for me as a kid. I sat in a room with Jeff Robinoff and Greg Silverman. There were a lot of conversations about humor, how much humor is going to be in there. And I'd say, well, if you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, there's a couple of great gags in there, but it's not a comedic film. They got that.
Batman may have made the front page, but Bruce Wayne got pushed to page 8.
I convinced David Goyer to come on the project, even though he had very little time. But he had such a knowledge of the comics, and he so understood my ambitions for it, my interest in it. He completely got the tone of film that I was talking about. So he was very helpful in figuring out what we could or couldn't do within the terms of the canon.
When I first spoke to Chris about doing Batman Begins, Chris said, I want to do it in a very grounded manner. I definitely want to do an origin story, and I'm definitely interested in capturing or exploring what happened from the time his parents were killed to the time he actually became Batman.
The idea of recreating a character, of re-establishing an icon, we didn't really have a framework to look at for how you do that. And I remember very clearly saying to the studio, what do you need in this film? Like, what are you going to be upset about? What are you going to be missing?
I said to him, well, would it be cool, would it fit into your version if he had a car? Because I love the Batmobile.
And I remember very clearly sitting there and nodding and going, okay, I'll think about how to do that. But knowing that I couldn't conceive of any way at that stage to get the Batmobile into the film. I had been assuming we would not deal with that at all, that would be something that if somebody made sequels later on, because it seemed so fanciful. But once I'd heard that from the studio, they weren't imposing it, but it was clear that just emotionally, it wasn't going to be Batman for them without the Batmobile. They weren't saying they needed to sell a bunch of toys or anything. It was just kind of like, it's going to be disappointing without it. And I thought, okay, I'll take that on board. And it became a narrative challenge to sit there with David Goyer and figure out how do we make that credible in our telling.
There shouldn't be anything Batman really does because of style. It should always be function over form. And we felt that in some of the previous iterations of Batmobile, it'd been form over function. Once you say it's got to be realistic, how can you figure this out in the real world? It leads you to some problems, but it also leads you to some really interesting solutions.
He wanted this sort of urban assault vehicle, and he sort of, off the cuff, he thought, like a Humvee and an old 70s Lamborghini. So I went to Toys R Us and bought a Humvee, and I went over to the model store and bought, I think it was a Lamborghini Corniche, and I smashed them together to see what they'd look like. I just cut them up and stuck them together. And they looked awful. But that's how we got going.
And it became one of the most important elements of the film. And indeed, it was probably the first line I wrote on the film, really before David had even written his draft, was the, the does it come in black line. Because selling the Batmobile had sort of become symbolic to me of the entire process that we're going to have to go through in terms of making Batman a credible cinematic figure in this more realistic telling. The Batmobile, the costume, Gotham itself has to be completely rethought. You're having to update all these things. You're having to really try and view them through a contemporary lens.
Chris is coming out to my office in New York, sitting down to have conversations about, is it okay if we don't put the yellow circle around? Because I think that doesn't quite work. Chris was very concerned about how far he could go and always very sensitive on that issue. But we would keep looking.
Really, with Batman, it was all about the darkness visually. The ears, the cape. And it sounds obvious in retrospect, but what you learn very rapidly is without that cape, he isn't Batman. He's some kind of futuristic SWAT type guy, Without the ears and the cape, no matter how much else you retain, it's not Batman without those elements.
We live in the 21st century, and our Ulysses and our Achilles were Batman and Superman for many of us. Those were the sagas that we took to heart. And growing up with mythology like that, reading the comics of Batman, you hear your own Batman. Through that narrative, we process the world. It's like a religion. Each man has his own Jesus, Your Jesus can be vengeful and righteous, and my Jesus can be forgiving and loving. And there's no right Jesus in the same way that there's no right Batman.
Anyone who took the job seriously and read all the comic books that we read and did all the thinking about it that you have to try to do justice to the story would recognize there's no definitive version of this character. You were just the latest custodian, so you just tried to do a version that did justice to who the character had been along the way. Chris gave me a copy of The Dark Knight Returns when I was a kid. I think it was for my 13th birthday, and it just blew me away. And I read Batman Year One, I thought that was even better. So, approaching the movies as a Batman fan, I wouldn't just want to see a story I already knew. And so for me, I was constantly trying to weave notes or melodies that you're familiar with, but presented in kind of a wholly original, in a sort of sum of its parts way.
And I think what Chris has done is he's taken the best of Batman and then sort of the coolest bits of his aesthetic and joined them together. He didn't allow the sort of preconceived notions about what Batman could be to stop him from, you know, using Batman to explore like more serious parts of ourselves. That's the real leap that happened when Batman Begins came out. The first feeling you got was that this is definitely not made in a boardroom. This is like someone's point of view on this.
The boldness of Chris saying, I'm going to take these kind of incredibly out there constructs and I'm going to make you believe them. In fact, we're going to make that feel like that could happen tomorrow in New York City, because that's the world that we're living in now.
You know, he's interested in it being real. Not plausible, mind you. He can have the rooftop chase or the train fight. But he's interested in feeling real.
It's not necessarily about a direct reality, because I think the films are extremely heightened and they're extremely operatic. But it's about what I suppose you might term a cinematic reality. It's about giving the world of the films and the characters as much weight and validity as they would if your source material were not a comic book. If he was a character in another genre of film that you were having to introduce to the audience for the first time and get them to believe in. That's really what my use of the word reality is about. It's not about a literal reality. Part of the appeal of the world of Gotham is that it is not real life. It is removed from real life, and so you can address dramatic elements that would be extremely uncomfortable in a realistic film, in a way that lets the audience enjoy the experience and the entertainment, but hopefully gives them a little something to think about and gets under their skin in some ways.
There's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne. You and your friends better batten down the hatches.
You can find in these three films so much about the state of the modern world, about terrorism, about the economy.
The impulse in human beings to tear things down, the impulse to revolution.
Urban angst, anguish, fear of chaos, fear of death.
Family and politics and the past coming back to haunt.
You know, resolution to change. All those dynamics are embodied in the lives of these characters and how they interact.
These ideas are so pervasive in these movies that you walk out of them and you need to see them again and you're thinking about them and they have an emotional impact on you. Superhero genre movies are not supposed to have any emotional impact on you. They're called popcorn movies for a reason. And you go and you see one of these movies and you realize like half of your popcorn has gone uneaten because you just became completely and totally riveted by the story.
I mean, who wants to go see a 3-hour movie about terrorism and the economy? But if you do it within the context of a Batman movie, maybe you actually can have more of an effect talking about those things than if you did it more directly.
He takes all these sort of themes that we're wrestling with in the real world, and he uses Batman and he uses Gotham to really explore these themes. What is justice? How do we define justice? How do we define heroism? Can we believe in the whole concept of heroism anymore? Do the ends justify the means?
I do think that this fundamental idea of consequence really drives all three of these movies. Whatever your own political leanings are, it's easy for us to say like, hey, yay, yay, America, we're the best in the world, everything that we do is right. And especially if some little guy is getting picked on, it's important for us to come sort of sweeping in there and beat up the big bad aggressor. And just like Batman does, but then you have to stop and think, but during the process of doing that, what is the consequence of my action? And am I creating any jokers in the process? Because because there's going to be an effect of what I've just done. The Joker is essentially going to exist now. He is the consequence of my action, and I'm going to have to deal with that. Because he's going to come and knock it.
Gentlemen, time to spread the word. And the word is panic.
In the post 9/11 world, one of the biggest weapons that terrorists and villains, if you will, use is fear and paranoia and having us on our heels.
The breaking down of everything.
The powerful will be ripped from their decadent nests.
The order we're used to, changing utterly.
And cast out into the cold world that we know and endure.
Us not knowing what's on the horizon. Not the fear of modernity, the fear of post-modernity. You know, those are the anxieties that are kind of below the mainstream media, below CNN. These are the dark currents that are really kind of, you know, keep us awake at night sometimes.
Batman, by his very nature, leads you into discussions of anarchy versus a dictatorship. And I've read these op-ed pieces in some of the largest papers, even the New York Times, and you know, the far right is saying, oh, if Batman were around, he'd be a Republican, and other people say, no, he's a much more subversive character, and he'd be very far to the left of the dial. And the fact of the matter is, part of what's happening in the Batman films that we've done is that perhaps Bruce hadn't thought through all the ramifications of what putting on that suit would mean. That it's one man trying to address some really complicated problems.
Chris has a very interesting literary background or interest. You can see in some of the stuff maybe just passing, like the reference to Sidney Carlton and Tale of Two Cities at the end of the third film. Bruce Wayne echoes Sidney Carlton's journey in many, many ways, even if they are personas, the playboy, the hero, the self-sacrifice, and so forth. But the really interesting part for me is Chris's relationship with an almost secret writer from Latin America that we love, Jorge Luis Borges.
Borges' influence on the Dark Knight films in particular is all about bridging that divide between, I suppose, the higher aspirations of you know, trying to make people think about a particular philosophical dilemma, but couching it very much in the thriller. Borges really understood that relationship and could make incredibly atmospheric short stories that would suck you into a philosophical conceit in a very, very entertaining way.
In the sequence in The Dark Knight, when the people were on the boat and they had to make a decision, do they press the button and blow up the other boatload full of people in order to save their own skin, or do they not? People were telling me in the darkness of the movie theaters, no matter who they were with, a parent, a date, a spouse, a kid, very quietly, they made their own moral determination as to what they would do.
We need to get these folks in quickly.
For a comic book, superhero movie, to move people to this point, to become so thematically important, to have such heft, to have such weight, is incredible. And that is very specifically one of the ways that the Dark Knight trilogy raised the bar for all comic book films.
It's all part of the plan.
When I look back at the trilogy, it's actually kind of shocking to me how much the three films feel like a beginning, a middle, and an end. Because we very much approach them as individual films. When we made Batman Begins, we didn't think there was ever going to be another one.
Chris approaches these films, I think, in a way that's very different than most people or most studios approach these films. He's been very reticent to approach something from the get-go as if we're doing a trilogy. He doesn't like to plan things as sequel bait or plant things that would only pay off until a second film.
And Chris always came from a perspective of, yeah, but is it essential? Let's not make a movie just because, you know, there's an appetite for it. Let's make a movie because we have something to say. if you could seek out the kind of rules hidden in and amongst all of the different versions of the character, the ones that mattered, the ones that really mattered, and then try to tell a complete story there with an arc.
It is the most perfectly logical way to do this kind of fiction.
Turn it on.
And each part has a beginning, middle, and end. Each movie stands perfectly well on its own. Look at the three of them and you have an overstory that is better than each of the three movies, as good as they are.
If we want to call it the superhero genre, you could say that had never been done in that genre of film.
Batman Begins is very much a hero's journey. It's an origin story, it's an origin myth, and so it has a sense of romanticism or theatricality that embraces that story model. With The Dark Knight, in order to change the scale of the film, we went to a city story, we went to a crime epic. That allows you to look at all these different aspects of Gotham society. It suggests shooting on location, on real streets more. There's a city-based socioeconomic idea behind the film that demands a different visual approach. And then moving that into The Dark Knight Rises, we move into the arena of the disaster movie, or the historical epic. A film that embraces all of Gotham, all the humanity there, lots of different people encountering tumultuous events. So we chose to increase the scale not by sort of just blowing up the balloon, if you like, which sequels get into trouble doing, but by shifting genres.
Always kind of fascinated with the rules of genre and the tropes of genre. The tropes, the rules of the genre become things the audience rely on, and it's very easy to knock that out from under them. It's very easy to trick them. I remember sitting in the audience watching a friends and family screening of The Dark Knight for the first time. We come to that moment where Batman is put in the impossible situation, again, that every superhero always finds himself in, from Superman onwards, of do you save the damsel in distress, your girlfriend, or do you save the busload of civilians, or the cable car full of New Yorkers, or in this case, your ally, Harvey Dent. And though the Joker twists the rule set on him, you're sort of barreling towards this moment of waiting for him to magically save both of them, and he doesn't. He doesn't. He loses. And I just remember sitting in that movie theater, and you could hear a pin drop. And I've been waiting for this moment for a couple of years because we'd found a trope that was so blindingly obvious, which is that, well, he's the hero. He's always going to rescue everybody. But what happens if he doesn't?
I think actually the discussion of Harvey Dent and how he plays in the three films is very indicative of how difficult it is to answer the question about, was it always planned as a trilogy? Because very early on, when David Goyer and myself talked about Harvey Dent and how he might play, in the Bruce Wayne story, which loosely was saying, okay, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that lends itself to 3 movies, a 3-act structure, but that was about as far as we ever got. And I think Harvey Dent was part of that because we did talk about introducing him. And in fact, I think in David's earliest draft, Larry Holden's character is actually referred to as Harvey Dent.
Falcone has half the city, bought and paid for. Drop it.
How can you say that?
Because as much as I care about getting Falcone, I care more about you.
And then we changed our minds because we weren't going to make a second film, as far as we knew. We were putting all our eggs in one basket. And so the function that Harvey Dent would have had in the first film didn't justify using the name of the character. We said, no, we're just going to make this one movie and we're going to make it as good as it possibly could be. Decided to make a second film, we did the same thing. And if we knew we were doing a third film, there might have been an argument for spreading Two-Face's story over another film. And that's the kind of trap you fall into when you're looking too far ahead, because we wouldn't have made The Dark Knight the way we made it, and it was made, in my opinion, the right way for the story we wanted to tell. We didn't hold anything back for a third film. We didn't keep Two-Face alive for any reason. And then when you get into The Dark Knight Rises and you realize that Harvey Dent's story hangs over the events of it, that was all that was needed. That if we followed the consequences of Harvey Dent and Two-Face's story in The Dark Knight, how it was dealt with would take us interesting places in The Dark Knight Rises.
I think with a lot of these so-called superhero trilogies now, they make the first one, and then they sit around a table and they say, okay, who's our villain going to be for the second one? And then they start writing a story from that. We never thought that was a particularly organic approach. We thought that was kind of backwards. So what we tended to do is say, with The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, actually we did it even with Batman Begins. We said, what kind of story do we want to tell about our protagonist?
In the past, really, the Batman was a setup for the menagerie of bad guys that would be in those movies, not Chris's vision. Yes, the bad guys are important, but Bruce Wayne was the key.
The way the scripts were engineered was that this was not just a villain of the week situation. The villains were yardsticks to reveal where Bruce Wayne was as a vigilante and as a hero and as a man. And through his experiences with him, through his battles with him, his successes and failures, they changed him. And that change was necessary to build an arc of a character that ran through 3 films.
Seeing Bruce Wayne's story, it's a whole arc. Like if you watch 1, 2, and 3 all together, clearly there's a beautiful arc of a character there and had a beginning, middle, and an end.
We spent 9 years making the films, and so we were able to develop each act of the 3-act story over a long period of time and really change our vision for it, let it develop with us over that period of time. For me, that made the films richer than they would have been if we'd come up with a plan for 3 movies right at the beginning and stuck to that.
And in this way, Nolan keeps it fresh and keeps it vital, pushing himself creatively. We benefit from that. It's one of the great pleasures of this franchise, that we get a filmmaker who is not just cranking out episodes. He's giving us real movies every time out.
99% of what you read that very first time in the script is what that film is, in my experience. So he has that vision going into it, and a lot of that is he's confident that he cast the right people.
I'll be standing where I belong, between you and the people of Gotham.
We knew we needed Batman first. That was always the key, is getting that first, and we did that before we even had a script. And we knew that we wanted the best actor and somebody without too many past associations. Christian Bale was the first actor I met in relation to the project, actually, and as is often the case in these processes, his first guy I met, he then went off and did a whole other movie and whatever, and meanwhile I met every other young actor in town, every single one.
It was an interesting process because I think a lot of them actually said to him, oh, well, I'm really interested in working with you, but I don't know if I want to do a superhero movie.
We started to whittle down a list of who had enough gravitas, who had enough darkness in their soul, who, really could fit it physically.
We knew we would have to test the actor, however convinced I might be, might not be, because testing's something I'd never done before. But we were going to need to show everybody at the studio how this actor was going to be able to play Bruce Wayne and play Batman.
And we needed to test each of the actors as Bruce Wayne and Batman because they're actually quite different characters.
You didn't want to kind of go, well, okay, he's an action guy, but I never buy him as a billionaire, and vice versa.
Bruce?
And carrying a love story, because that was also a huge part of Batman Begins.
Rachel,
There also needed to be some humor there. You know, he's a playboy. There's a lot of fun involved with who that character is.
What are you doing?
Just swimming.
The actor that we were going to be casting needed to do many different things.
Wow. It's good to see you.
I miss you.
When I had my actors who tested, we devised a way of, shooting a Bruce Wayne on his own, kind of looking out the window, as it were, the private Bruce Wayne. Then he moves into a party setting and he's the more glib guy.
Happy birthday, Bruce.
Oh, Mr. Earl, good of you to come.
Not everybody thought you'd make it this far.
Sorry to disappoint.
And then we had a couple of scenes as Batman.
Who was with Falcone at the docks? I don't know, I swear to God.
Swear to me! We had decided to do the tests on film and make them look as much like a real movie as possible. We drew one of the old costumes from, I think, the Val Kilmer Batman film, with somebody who could show us how to put it on somebody and all that. I spoke to them a lot about what I was trying to achieve with Bruce Wayne. When it comes to Batman, I had no idea what I was looking for in truth. Because you simply don't know how the actor is then going to put this very fanciful costume on and make this guy believable in that world. All I could do was really give them ideas on the logic behind aspects of the costume, the idea that it's meant to terrify and threaten criminals. I certainly let them know that we were intending to present Batman in a very obscure way, that is to say, very darkly lit. I always likened Batman's presence in Batman Begins to the alien in the first Alien, where you really barely see him. He's extremely terrifying to criminals in that. But beyond that, really, you're just giving them the indicators of tone.
You know, it's funny, Amy Adams did me a favor and did the screen test opposite them.
Cobb. It was Cobb. Look, we need to go. We need to tell
Rest. Gordon knows.
Well, the testing process on this kind of performance, this kind of character, it's not about acting ability or chemistry or any of those things.
Gotham needs you.
And you serve Gotham?
I serve justice.
It's about being able to project this extraordinary iconography, really, from the inside. It's visual iconography. Christian, somehow he'd figured this out before the screen test, that you could not give a normal performance. You could not give an ordinary performance. You had to project massive energy through this costume in order to not question the costume.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
So it's about feeling and a voice, and I think Christian's voice was a big part of the impression he made in the test.
Trouble?
Nothing I can't handle.
He knows who was at the docks.
He won't talk.
He'll talk to me.
He had decided that Batman needed to have a different voice to Bruce Wayne, that he needed to put on a voice.
Who was with Falcone at the docks?
I don't know, I swear to God.
Swear to me.
That supported the visual appearance of the character and explained why people don't recognize him from his voice.
What in God's name are you?
It was pretty logically thought out.
I'm Batman.
The casting of Christian Bale sent a signal early on that this was going to be a whole different kind of Batman.
And casting Morgan Freeman and Michael Caine and these sort of supporting roles, they do wonders for these movies in terms of getting us to really kind of buy into the reality.
And you see that their characters are going to have their own little story arcs within the bigger picture. That's going to add a lot of depth to a film.
If you start casting actors and actresses who have all been nominated for Oscars, you actually sort of transcend genre and you're going for something different.
Chris's approach had always been that he wanted to do what Donna had done with Superman. He really wanted to populate the world with amazing actors because that's the way it feels real to an audience. We were incredibly lucky with the actors that we got because at that point, I don't know that it was a foregone conclusion that great actors like that would want to be in a superhero movie.
I'm sure from a studio standpoint, it was almost probably weirdly a risk to go with the best actors for the roles as opposed to the most famous people for the roles.
We also had Cillian Murphy's screen test for Batman.
Who was with Falcone at the docks?
He wasn't right for that part in the way that Christian was. But the performance was incredible, and everybody took huge notice of it while we were shooting it and while we watched the tests.
Joe murdered my parents, and they deserve...
Don't pretend you wanted to do this for them.
I then was able to go to the studio and ask to put him in as Crane, as Scarecrow in Batman Begins.
What's the next shot, Chris? On a horse. So Killian, not too much leaning.
Yeah, no, I'm just
allow...
Just pretending I'm on a horse.
Yeah, don't pretend you're on a horse, just be.
Even though traditionally in past iterations of Batman films, they'd always insisted on as big a star as possible, playing the sort of fanciful villains. Having seen Killian's test, they were very, very happy to put him in there.
So, rehearsal's up, guys. Stand by for rehearsal, please.
Crime cannot be tolerated. Criminals thrive on the indulgence of society's understanding. We know this.
Well, Liam had never played a villain at the time, and he played a lot of mentor-like characters. My view was that you wanted Ducard to have familiarity as a mentor. You wanted him to be played by somebody who you would immediately gravitate towards. The way that Bruce is desperately gravitating towards an aunt or a father figure, something to cling to.
Because I think I should be sympathetic to what he's saying. You know what I mean? Just as a little audience ruse, you know.
Liam so wonderfully presents that. He's so seductive in terms of his philosophical ideas and the way he presents them. For years afterwards, I was worried that there'd be, Boy Scouts all over the world taking his advice on how to stay warm, in front of the campfire, which I just had written as a load of old nonsense, that rub your, whatever it is, rub your chest, your arms will take care of themselves. And he just presents that as a very convincing little bit of information that if anyone's watching this and goes camping, it's based on nonsense.
Thursday, give myself a bit of a walk in. Get some
exercise.
Rehearsing and action.
I met with Gary for Ra's al Ghul, for Ducard originally, because he's an actor I admired so tremendously, and I wanted to get him in the film.
Action! Flash, Ghouling!
He had played a lot of villains, and he wasn't really interested in playing another villain in our film. I mean, he met with me, and we got on very well. But something wasn't sitting right with him about being, the villain in the Batman film. So I called him a few days later and just completely changed direction. I said, what about, got this great character of Commissioner Gordon. And Gary was very respectful to the actors who'd played the part in the past, but my take was that they really hadn't done much with that character in any of the other visual tellings.
Nobody takes him down. Why? He's paid up with the right people.
I really wanted to get somebody as great as Gary Oldman so that you could drill into the essential integrity of the character in a corrupt world.
And the DA brave enough to prosecute.
Played a lot of extremely fascinating, very deeply flawed individuals.
Watch for my sign. You're just one man. Now we're two.
But I'd never seen him play a straightforwardly good man.
This way, that way.
As I started to write the character of Lucius, I did something that I've always avoided doing in the past, really, which is I did write with Morgan Freeman in mind. To try and write a characterization around an actor can be limiting, and I tried not to make it limiting. I wrote a part I hadn't seen him play before, but I knew that I really wanted him in there, and I pursued him for many, many months. Whatever he tells you now, he was very difficult to convince. I actually flew to Memphis to meet with him in person and really explain why the part needed him. And eventually he said yes and turned up.
Hang on 1 second. Okay, doors shut, please, Morgan. We'll shut the doors.
But I was quite relieved when he actually turned up to shoot, because I'd begun to believe it was never going to happen. But I managed to get him in the end.
Should I just bury the past out there with my parents, Alfred?
I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do with your past, sir. Just know that there are those of us who care about what you do with your future.
I went to see Michael at his house, got him to read the script. As he likes to tell the story, I sort of sat there while he read it, and it's relatively true. I certainly needed an answer very quickly.
Haven't given up on me yet.
Never.
Got it there. Lovely.
But really my pitch to him was, this is a character who's going to have the potential to steal the whole movie. I then told him that I'd said the same thing to Gary Oldman as Gordon and Lucius. But no, in truth, I think he understood when he read the script that he could do exactly what I was suggesting with Alfred. Alfred has always had the potential to really steal the movie, because there's just so many possibilities emotionally in terms of the role he's having to play in Bruce Wayne's life. That not really having been addressed before.
The scene in The Dark Knight Rises on the stairs between Christian Bale and Michael Caine, where Alfred is really pleading his heart out to Bruce Wayne to throw in the towel as Batman, is an incredibly moving scene. It's not a very long scene, but somehow the entire history of these two characters and their relationship is right there in that scene, and that's something that great actors can really do, that maybe somebody who's in a band doing their first movie or something like that, or a supermodel, they don't have that same technique.
Bang! What was that? And bang! And bang! And they're in the corner.
Aaron Eckhart in The Dark Knight has to really start out as this extraordinarily trustworthy sort of all-American hero figure. And in the last act of that film, he's required to channel that into something altogether evil. We knew we were going to have to do the effect digitally. I wanted it to be a little bit unreal because we wanted it to be shocking but not depressing. And so I felt that with CG, there was a little more of a window for the audience to accept it in a slightly more comfortable way. And what that meant for Aaron was we had to try and involve him in the design of it as much as possible and show him it as much as possible as we were developing it with him. But I also had them apply the scalp, the bear scalp and everything. That was actually a prosthetic piece that we gave him because we wanted that awareness. You wanted him to be able to look in the mirror and see something different, see some of the distortion that was going to happen to the scalp, and to feel that and be wearing that in a sense. And even actually the application of the motion tracking dots and so forth, by going through that process, I think he could feel something on him that was helpful to him, actually. For Dark Knight Rises, I'd worked with Tom before, and I knew that he's somebody capable of all sorts of different types of performances and physicality and so forth. And with Bane, really, you're concealing, almost the entire guy's face. So for me, it was more a question of calling up Tom and saying, look, there's two ways to go with this. We either hire just a physical performer and then put a voice on afterwards, or I try and get an actor like yourself to give an all-round, performance on set, voice, appearance, eyes, everything. I really wanted to find somebody who could give me everything on set. So when Tom agreed to do it, I was delighted. I mean, he's a very unique performer in that regard, that he'll take on a challenge like that. We knew we were going to have to find our Catwoman. And showed very clearly in the tests that she could present a very realistic, truthful characterization of Selina Kyle.
Who are you pretending to be?
I'm Bruce Wayne, eccentric billionaire.
And then just showed immediately that she understood the largeness of performance, the theatricality that had to be there when the costume was on. And indeed, Anne with Catwoman, it's about having a human presence that actually animates this costume. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do.
You don't owe these people. You've given them everything.
Not everything. Not yet.
One of the other remarkable things about these movies is even the smallest parts are played by really terrific actors. Christopher Nolan has almost that Quentin Tarantino type ability to bring back actors that we haven't seen in a while. Whether it's Rutger Hauer in Batman Begins.
Yeah, we should allow ourselves to stop thinking about what Thomas Wayne would have done.
Or Eric Roberts in The Dark Knight.
They're wise to your act. You've got rules. The Joker, he's got no rules.
who have these little parts in which they're terrific for 2 or 3 scenes, and you think, boy, where's that person been for the last 10 or 15 years?
It really came out of Chris thinking, well, who haven't we seen? What's fresh that I can kind of add into this?
Maybe accentuate with no word from the bat, without being comical.
They are some of the top performers of their generation in their field, and so if you can convince them to do a smaller part, you avail yourself of that gravity.
With no word from the Batman, even as they mourn Commissioner Loeb, these cops have to be wondering if the Joker is going to make good on his threat in the obituary section of the Gotham Times to kill the mayor. I'm Mike Engel, Gotham.
Stand by. Honor, guard, attention. Hook, port, horse. Ready? Aim. Fire. Ready? Aim. Fire. Ready? Aim.
Jack Nicholson's version of the Joker had become an icon, sort of seminal performance. To find somebody willing to try and redo that in a completely different way, and the inevitable comparisons that would result, that was quite a challenge.
We had a few conversations. He met with a few other actors for that role. And surprisingly, some people were like, they didn't want to go up against the Jack Nicholson, shoes. They were afraid and intimidated by that. And so we also knew it was going to take somebody courageous to kind of fill those shoes and go up against what was in everybody's head.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Heath was somebody I'd met with over the years for different roles. Indeed, I'd met him for Batman at the same time as I met, every actor in town. He explained why he didn't want to do something like that. He was very polite about it, but very clear. And so I was sort of surprised to get the call, because it really more came from his end about wanting to get involved, wanting to talk to me about what we would be doing. And I sat down with him for a couple of hours. There was nothing for him to read, but we saw absolutely eye to eye on the bigger picture idea of who this guy was going to be. We talked about common reference points. We talked about Malcolm McDowell's performance of Clockwork Orange in the film. We talked about Clockwork Orange, the book, and who Alex is in the book, because it's kind of different. We looked at paintings by Francis Bacon for visual reference. We looked at all kinds of things, talked about all kinds of different philosophical ideas behind the Joker and anarchy and chaos and what he would represent. And Heath was just ready to do it. He was ready to do something that big.
I'll settle for his loved ones.
So after that first meeting, it was very clear to me that it was going to be an incredibly exciting road to go down.
You remind me of my father. I hated my father.
So we, went through the process of deal making and announcing and everything. And I think the whole world turned around and said, "What do you do?" Heath Ledger, Joker, it didn't make any sense to people at all. We didn't want to have that moment on Heath where we just sort of, made him dress up as the Joker and suddenly he's the Joker. That would have felt very artificial, and so he developed the look of the character with Lindy Hemming, the costume designer, with John Caglione, who did the makeup, and myself over a long period of time. So we would experiment with pieces of it. What would the shoes be? I think the shoes were actually the first thing that Lindy found that Heath was like, no, those are exactly the right shoes.
This wall is a sort of conglomeration of all the images that we started out with. I wrote there Terence Stamp, Bill Wyman, Iggy Pop, Adam Ant, Keith Richards. This is a sort of, like an amalgam of shirt fabrics and ties. Everything with a little bit of edge and a bit of jagginess. And these are his colour, different colours, kind of safely going towards a really black purple, and then thinking, no, we've got to do it, come back here to the purple, And this is a panel of the final decided fabrics and colours.
One thing Heath wanted to do was to apply the makeup himself. As an actor, he's saying, okay, this character would put his own makeup on, in real life, and so what would that look like if he just got the makeup? The thing that stuck from that is he always had makeup on his fingers and under his fingernails and everything, as he would have from putting it on just with his hands. During the hair and makeup test, we let him perform We let him talk, we let him walk around, we didn't record any sound, but we let him inhabit the character and use it as a bit of a test bed, to just sort of do it in front of a few people and start to feel what that would be and move around. And we had some props there, we had different knives and things for him to pick up and start moving with and seeing how that would work. And it was a really, amazing experience to be a part of, to see him developing something in that way.
It really is a performance that is done with no safety net.
This town, it deserves a better class of criminal.
It really just goes for broke, and those are the performances that endure.
And I'm gonna give it to him.
The execution of that role, the performance he gives there transcends anything that you want to call a comic book movie or an action movie.
It's just one of the most iconic movie performances of modern times.
I make my own luck.
Christopher Nolan is so insistent on doing things live on the set in camera when you can. And even when using CGI, sort of using it to augment practical physical effects that are being done in camera. And I think that whether the audience is conscious of it or not, subconsciously, you know when you're watching a movie if what you're seeing on the screen is really happening or not. It's one of the reasons that so many of the movies from the pre-CGI era, whether it's Star Wars or Star Trek or the original Superman, where the effects were created with models and miniatures and matte paintings, are so beloved because you feel like you could reach out and touch what's on the screen. Even if you know it's a trick shot somehow, it has a presence, it has a kind of physical presence. And I think that's something that Christopher Nolan has really labored to achieve in these Batman films, because those were the movies that turned him on as a young filmgoer. So there's been a real conscious effort to, make these state-of-the-art comic book movies in a kind of analog way.
There it goes, detached.
People may not realize that for films of this size, the Dark Knight movies actually have a relatively small number of computer graphic shots in them.
I think the first Alien probably had about 50 visual effects shots in it. The first Star Wars probably about 300, and that was a huge thing. Those shot counts go to now, you're in the thousands, you're into 1,800 shots, 2,000 shots. But I think that by restricting ourselves, we didn't do it numerically, but by philosophically trying to go back to an in-camera approach. I think Dark Knight Rises, I think we were at 530 shots or something like that. It's a very small number of shots compared with other movies of the time. It means that in terms of interesting the audience, in terms of giving them value for money in the narrative, you're having to do it in different ways.
For example, the great truck flip in The Dark Knight. We really flipped that truck. A lot of guys would have not flipped that truck. They would have done that in a visual effect.
I certainly never tried to put any kind of visual effects restriction on the films. But my absolutist view of the way computer graphics works is that it's animation, and so if it's created whole cloth and not manipulated from something that you've shot, whether it's live action or a miniature, there's always an understanding on the audience's part, somewhere in the subconscious, that they're seeing a drawing, they're seeing animation as opposed to photography. Sequences like, Bane's sort of taking over of Gotham, we had to very carefully plot out how we were going to keep it grounded and real. The technique we most often used was to try and simply balance a number of shots between big visual effects shots and then things we could do in camera with on-the-floor effects, so that the editing rhythm, once Lee was able to put it together, you'd be continually alternating between something that's real, something that's convincingly photographed on set,
Mind your ears, guys.
and then something that's heavily relying on Paul Franklin and his visual effects team to put those things together. The destruction of the football field. Obviously, I challenge everybody to put as many real elements in that frame as possible. From the dirt flying in the air to the guys falling in the holes. And I think that what Paul and his team did with the shot is pretty amazing. My sort of rule of thumb was we could do a fanciful visual effects sequence if the last shot was real. If you could make the punchline to your sequence a real element. When Batman Begins, when we did the Batmobile through the waterfall into the Batcave, or Dark Knight Rises, the truck coming down from the street above, those are intended to be the punchline. They're intended to be the stamp on the end of, an action sequence. If those things can be clearly real and clearly have a sort of grittiness to them, it buys you a lot before that's more fanciful.
Christopher Nolan has always loved secrecy. He wants to preserve that cinema experience for us. He wants us to go into the theater without a lot of preconceptions, without a lot of spoilers in our head, and just sort of encounter the film as it is.
The problem with the filmmaking process is it has to be done behind closed doors, and it has to be done privately, because you have to put on a magic show in a sense. You have to rehearse and figure it out, do it in front of the mirror, all of that, and then present it to people. And if you're letting them see how you're doing things, the relationship between the audience and the performers gets distorted. We've done various things over the years to keep them secret, under wraps. Probably the most extreme was with the funeral scene for Bruce Wayne. I knew that we couldn't really have the art department make up the correct name on the gravestone, because that would have been just too hard to keep under wraps. So we just went with a different name and used visual effects to change it. We went as far as having Christian there on set that day so that he would appear on the call sheet in case the call sheet leaked, in case there were long lens shots of the funeral. He would be there as a character as well. It was a little confusing for Michael Caine when he first arrived on set and Christian standing next to him at his own funeral. With certain elements of the film, it's very important to keep them secret.
He is an extremely precise filmmaker.
Slightly anticipated.
And still within that precision, he still is capable of allowing for spontaneous invention and inspiration.
Would it help as a lawyer if the driver had a name so you could go, let's get out of here? Yeah. Okay, Ryan, whatever his name is. Yeah. Let's get out of here. Ryan? Then...
Yeah, no, I think it would, yeah.
Give him a name.
What'd you just call it?
It's Ryan.
I can't tell you, but I'll take a look at the top of there.
Driver's called Ryan.
Yeah, why not?
What
It's real name's called.
Yeah, I'll take a look at the top of there first.
That sounds big. Okay, rehearsing and action.
Okay, Ryan.
He has bucked the idea of shooting in 3D and has instead created his larger-than-life illusions by shooting in IMAX.
Here we go. Quiet now. Hold all talk behind camera. And rolling on camera. And now!
To get that perspective shift, especially in cities, is marvelous. When you fly over the beginning of Dark Knight, or when you come over the parade, it's just stunning.
You know, we live in this age now where people can watch movies on their phones and their tablets, which is all fantastic. I love all the toys, but when I see somebody watching a Dark Knight movie on their phone, I want to take their phone away from them and throw it out the window, because there are some movies that really do need to be seen on the big screen, and in particular, IMAX.
Yeah, I've never seen them as superhero movies. I've never looked at them like that. Design-wise, the thing about all three films, to me, they're always separate films because there's very separate stories. Batman Begins was about why everything exists, and that journey is phenomenal. So that's what drove the design, really, the explanation. Dark Knight, for me, became our Batman, where I felt the design belonged, but we needed to do Batman Begins design-wise to get to the Dark Knight. You can't make that jump. And the Joker obviously is chaos and is anarchy, so everything was quite angular and harsh, hard lines and square lines for the Joker to react. And it's very civic. It's a modern civic feeling, and that's good for Den. The Dark Knight Rises, stylistically, it was really the first time I'd realized that now we're making a film that belongs to something else. Because I didn't consider The Dark Knight belonging to Batman Begins at all. I think it became about the scale of the world and maintaining a simplicity. Really, that's what the stepwell was about, mixing geometry with age. Design-wise, The Dark Knight Rises really became about the other two films.
You watch The Dark Knight Rises, you watch any of these three movies, and you feel every part of the movie you're seeing, the sets, the acting, the movie itself is a thing that has been physically constructed. The craftsmanship comes across. It's not made by a machine or by a computer or a committee. It's made by men and or women. It's a craft, you know, it needs craftsmen to do it. There's a tactile feeling about the movies. It's really palpable, you can feel it when you watch them.
For him to defend the physical, analog, handmade nature of film is an important position. If you think of most of the leading filmmakers, most of them have given up. They don't build sets. They don't hire extras.
Thanks, guys. Always. Thanks, guys. Batman #1. Excellent job.
They don't use film.
Hey, checking the gates.
And they favor digital. So in that, he is a singular man. And there is great value in a true artistic position that will entertain a lot of people.
We give it back to you, the people.
With Batman Begins, when we came to market the film, it was a bit of a shock to realize how difficult it was to convey to the audience that this was something different, that if they'd been disenchanted with the idea of going to see a Batman film, that no, we're starting all over, this is something you haven't seen before.
His goal was obviously to give a whole new birth to this particular property, and it had to look and feel utterly different. Luckily, the assets and ideas and motifs that Chris gave us all in his concepts, these things gave us a natural place to go to.
We tried not to think about this film as a superhero film.
So we took that first trailer and decided to reinvent it as a completely different animal.
They told me there was nothing out there, nothing to fear.
The first teaser trailer that went out for Batman Begins, it was a pretty radical approach. I think people found it a little disconcerting.
I went around the world, searched in all the shadows.
Because we were sort of showing them images that they wouldn't expect to see in that kind of film.
And there is something out there in the darkness. Something terrifying. Something that will not stop until it gets revenge.
You know, Batman wasn't in it until just a brief flash at the end.
Me.
I think that kind of approach has been very, very influential, and we actually try to follow that thread through the marketing of all three films, really trying to always do something a little different and a little surprising.
Chris knew right out the gate, if he was making a movie about Batman, that he was going to want to do it as differently as possible. That's going to be the drama that he brought to it, the realism, the science of it, as well as the art of it in terms of how he tells stories. We as marketers immediately recognize that this is a massive advantage to help us to position the movie differently than any predecessors.
You come up with a perspective and a point of view, a tone, and that informs everything you do. So whether it's the poster and what it looks like, the trailer and how it's cut and what the music feels like, it all has to fit into that darker, newer, grittier, more realistic kind of strategy.
And here we go.
Batman has a built-in audience. The challenge is, how do you make a film that fans want to go see, an event that everyone has to go see? So we engineered a strategy of viral campaigns.
Sort of like these extensions, entertainments unto themselves.
I don't know Harvey Dent.
Sort of viral entertainments.
News of the record-breaking turnout, though, was eclipsed by yet another story of the masked vigilante known as the Batman.
Seeding documents into the world, mysterious documents about the various characters, planting chalk marks all over the world, having fans attend Harvey Dent rallies. Or when it came time to release the third trailer for The Dark Knight, we staged a scavenger hunt. And instead of finding the traditional trailer, the fans found the Jokerized, hacked together, vandalized trailer that automatically told the fans that this was going to be an experience like no other. As the films pushed the envelope and changed the genre, it was necessary that our marketing campaign do the same.
In the case of The Dark Knight, I think it was very involving and very entertaining in a marketing sense. The concept of viral marketing being something quite new and fresh at the time, as applied to a big blockbuster in the way we did. Of course, the problem is that then immediately that approach gets co-opted by every other movie that comes after. So then you have to find something new.
Anyone could argue that this trilogy fundamentally rewrote the book on the superhero movie, and its ripple effects are so far-reaching. You can see it in other superhero movies, how their advertising campaigns are trying to employ a lot of the same techniques to showcase that this movie genre has grown up, and it is cinematic.
These three films have absolutely redefined how the world will see Batman moving forward in any other iteration that may come along. This will be the barometer.
You've changed things. Forever.
To the general public, they just see it as a good, cool summer movie. But do they understand, like, the difference? Like, do they realize the difference? I don't know. I hope they do. But in truth, if you really drill down on the difference, it's pretty vast and pretty incredible.
You got movie stars who are also Oscar-winning actors. You had critical acclaim. You also had nomination-worthy work.
The Dark Knight movies did establish that these kind of movies can be serious artistic objects in addition to being big pop culture blockbusters. These movies are in another category. I mean, the Dark Knight movies, to me, recall things like the Godfather trilogy and other sort of epic narratives in American cinema. I never hesitated to put these movies on my top 10 list at the end of the year, where maybe some critics do think, oh, that's not that kind of movie.
I feel like for all the money the pictures made, as good as the movies are, these movies are sadly underappreciated as works of art and as works of drama.
If you're out on the cutting edge, you can deliver a product that people could sit in a dark room and appreciate and react very, very positively to. And some few critics will really get. But it won't necessarily get the historical regard it's due until some time goes by. If you're motivated by the work, you manage to keep that in its proper place. I mean, people are going to be watching The Dark Knight films 20 years from now.
time renders justice to quality.
The movies are already watermarks of what can be done. Things to aspire to shoot for. They will forever be reflective of the highest possible way of telling this type of story in our time, with the intelligence and the passion in which we embrace the medium.